President.
Senator from Vermont is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. President, President Trump and the Republican leadership, as you just heard, are talking every day on television, news conferences, telling the American people how this tax bill that was passed here at 2 o'clock in the morning on Friday night without any hearings, with no serious debate, how this tax bill is designed to help the middle class and how it was written for the middle class. Unfortunately, I suspect that I will not shock too many Americans by suggesting that what President Trump has been saying is not truthful. This legislation, according to numerous independent studies, will provide 62% of the benefits to the top 1%. 62% of the benefits will go to the top 1%, while increasing taxes on 83 million middle-class households by the end of the decade. Now, why? And the reason is because the tax cuts for middle-class families expire by the end of 2025, while the tax breaks for large corporations are made permanent. Mr. President, we are living in a moment in American history where we have an unprecedented level of income and wealth inequality, where the top 0.1% now owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%, where the top 1% owns almost twice as much wealth as the bottom 90%, and if you can believe it, where 3 of the wealthiest people in this country, Mr. Gates, Mr. Bezos, and Mr. Buffett, 3 people own more wealth than the bottom half of the American population. That is where we are right now. Yet in the midst of this incredible level of income and wealth inequality, my Republican colleagues believe that this is a moment when 62% of the benefits of so-called tax reform should go to the top 1%, and 42% of the benefits should go to the top 0.1%, while at the same time, tens of millions of middle-class families will end up paying more in taxes. How crazy is that? So we have a situation in which the wealthy who need tax breaks the least will benefit the most, and the working class and middle class of this country, which need the most help, will benefit the least. The President of the United States and my Republican colleagues tell the American people that trickle-down economics, giving huge tax breaks to the wealthy and large corporations, will expand the economy. Just heard Senator Thune talking about that. They'll create new jobs and will bring in so much revenue that it will pay for the deficit it creates. Mr. President, every independent expert who has taken a look at this tax bill has said that it will substantially increase the deficit even after accounting for the possibility of increased economic growth. Joint Committee on Taxation has told us that this bill will increase the deficit by $1.4 trillion over the next decade. Now, why is that important? Well, first of all, it shows, if I may say, the hypocrisy of my Republican colleagues who year after year after year on this floor lectured us about the dangers of a $20 trillion national debt and growing deficits. We heard this time and time again. But somehow, when it comes to the need to provide tax breaks to billionaires, that concern about the deficit seems to have disappeared. But secondly, Mr. President, and more immediately, there is no doubt in my mind that if the Republicans are able to pass this bill, which will soon go to a conference committee, this bill, which gives huge tax breaks to the top 1% and raises the deficit by $1.4 trillion, there is no doubt in my mind that they will suddenly rediscover their great concern about deficits and the debt and move directly within the next few months to begin the process of cutting programs desperately needed by the working families of this country, the elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor. Now, Mr. President, this is not just Bernie Sanders speculating. This is what the New York Times said in a front-page article a few days ago, and I quote, front-page article, New York Times, quote, "As the tax cut legislation passed by the Senate early Saturday hurdles toward final approval, Republicans are preparing to use the swelling deficits made worse by the package as a rationale to pursue their long-held vision, undoing the entitlements of the New Deal and Great Society, leaving government leaner and the safety net skimpier for millions of Americans." Speaker Paul D. Ryan and other Republicans are beginning to express their big dreams publicly, vowing that next year they will move on to changes in Medicare and Social Security. President Trump told a Missouri rally last week, quote, "We're going to go into welfare reform," end of quote, New York Times. Mr. President, let me take this opportunity to translate into English what phrases like entitlement reform or welfare reform really mean. What they mean in reality are massive cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, nutrition programs, affordable housing, and other programs desperately needed by a declining middle class. It means that after they pass this so-called tax reform bill, which would provide a $200,000 tax break to CEOs who make over $16 million a year, they will come back to the floor of the Senate and fight for cuts to Social Security for senior citizens trying to survive on $12,000 or $13,000 a year. Massive cuts for millionaires and billionaires in their taxes at the same time as they want to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid for struggling seniors. Mr. President, it means, entitlement reform means that at a time when millions of seniors are splitting their pills in half because they cannot afford the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs, Republicans want massive cuts to Medicare. It means that when 2 out of every 3 nursing home residents in this country rely on Medicaid to pay for their long-term care, the Republicans want to make massive cuts to Medicaid. Now, we do not know exactly what form these cuts will take. I think that is not yet clear. There has been discussion among Republicans about raising the retirement age for Social Security to 70 years of age, forcing older workers to work years more before they can get their earned retirement benefits. Maybe they will cut back on cost of living increases through a so-called chain CPI. And that is a new formulation which means lower benefits not only for seniors but for millions of disabled veterans. They apparently believe, for those of you who are on Social Security now, that the COLAs you have been getting in recent years are just too high. That 0% increase you got a couple of years ago, just much too high. We got to change the formula and lower benefit increases. Or maybe they will go back to their long-term dream of privatizing Medicare, converting it into a voucher program, which will say to the elderly in this country, here is a check for $8,000, and you go out and you find private insurance on your own. And I would say good luck to any elderly person in this country who is struggling with heart disease or cancer, and you see what kind of insurance program you are going to get with a check of $8,000. Mr. President, I would remind my colleagues that many of these proposals were included in the budget resolution the Republicans voted for right here on the floor of the Senate. This is not speculation. These are issues and items that Republicans already voted for. They already voted for a $1 trillion cut to Medicaid, which would throw some 15 million Americans off of health insurance. They have already voted in the budget to cut Medicare by $473 billion. Mr. President, in my view, the last thing we should be doing is giving tax breaks for billionaires while cutting programs for the most vulnerable people in our country. Now, Mr. President, during the campaign, Donald Trump, as a candidate, promised he would not cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. He made that promise over and over again. And let me just quote here on some of these charts and some of these tweets exactly what Donald Trump said on the campaign trail. This is what he said, quote, "I was the first and only potential GOP candidate to state there will be no cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid," end of quote. On another occasion, he said, quote, "I am not a cutter. I'll probably be the only Republican that doesn't want to cut Social Security." That was January 24th, 2015. Quotes, Donald Trump, here it is. "It's my absolute intention," not being very vague about this one, Mr. President, his absolute intention to leave Social Security the way it is, not increase the age, and to leave it as it is, end of quote. Donald Trump, March 10th, 2016. And here's another quote, Mr. President, Donald Trump. Quote, "You know, Paul Ryan wants to knock out Social Security, knock it down, way down. He wants to knock Medicare way down. And frankly, well, two things. Number one, you're going to lose the election if you're going to do that. Now, I want to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. I want to do a lot of things to it that are going to make it much better, actually. But I am not going to cut it, and I am not going to raise ages, and I'm not going to do all of the things that they want to do. But they want to really cut it, and they want to cut it very substantially, the Republicans, and I'm not going to do that," end of quote. Well, before I get on to the next quote, I want to tell Donald Trump as a candidate, man, he was exactly right. This is what he said on March 29, 2016. He said the Republicans wanted to cut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Well, candidate Trump, you are exactly right, because that is now what we will see in a few weeks or a few months. Another quote from Donald Trump as a candidate. Social Security faces a problem. 77 million baby boomers set to retire. Now, I know there are some Republicans who would be just fine with allowing these programs to wither and die on the vine. The way they see it, Social Security and Medicare are wasteful entitlement programs, but people who think this way need to rethink their position. It's not unreasonable for people who paid into a system for decades to expect to get their money's worth. That's not an entitlement, that's honoring a deal. End of quote. Well, there it is, Mr. President. Candidate Donald Trump said over and over and over again that he would not cut Social Security, he would not cut Medicare, he would not cut Medicaid, and in fact, quite correctly, he predicted that the Republicans would try to do exactly that. And now I would like to talk directly, if I might, to the President of the United States. And I would say, Mr. President, on the campaign trail, you said over and over again, you would not cut Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid. And today, I am asking you nothing more than to keep your words. Don't lie to the American people. Millions of people voted for you because you said you would not cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Keep your word. Tell Senate Leader McConnell and tell House Speaker Paul Ryan that you will veto any legislation that cuts these programs. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.